A compound sentence is when two independent clauses are joined together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Remember those fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. These conjunctions are not strong enough to connect two independent clauses without a comma. To decide if your sentence needs a comma, cover the coordinating conjunction and check to see if there is an independent clause on each side. Jeff explained to Mrs. Clark that he had become hungry, so he had left quietly to avoid disrupting the class. My coordinating conjunction is so. I'm going to cover it up and look at both sides. Jeff explained to Mrs. Clark that he had become hungry. He had left quietly to avoid disrupting the class. I'm looking at two independent clauses. That means that I do need a comma. Mrs. Clark started to accuse him of disrespect, but Jeff explained that their former teacher had always allowed them to leave for snacks. My coordinating conjunction is but. Let's take a look at both sides. Mrs. Clark started to accuse him of disrespect. Jeff explained that their former teacher had always allowed them to leave for snacks. I'm looking at two independent clauses, so I do need a comma. He told her that this had been their class rule and he had not meant any disrespect towards Mrs. Clark. Let's cover up our coordinating conjunction and then look at both sides. He told her that this had been their class rule. He had not meant any disrespect towards Mrs. Clark. Again, I have two independent clauses, so I do need a comma. Jeff thought that Mrs. Clark would freak out and send him to the office. I'm going to cover up my coordinating conjunction and Jeff thought that Mrs. Clark would freak out. Send him to the office. I'm not looking at two independent clauses this time. Send him to the office does not have a subject, and it cannot stand on its own. Therefore, this coordinating conjunction does not take on a comma. Mrs. Clark just sighed and shook her head slowly back and forth. Well, I have two coordinating conjunctions in this sentence. Let's look at both of them one at a time. If I take out my first and, I'm looking at Mrs. Clark just sighed. On the other side, shook her head slowly back and forth. Shook her head slowly back and forth cannot stand on its own. There is no subject here. If it had said she shook her head slowly back and forth, then I would have been looking at a compound sentence and would have needed a comma. But in this case, I know I do not need a comma before this coordinating conjunction. Let's look at the other one. The only thing on one side of this is the word fourth. Clearly, I do not have a sentence on the other side, so I do not need a comma here either. She told him to come back to class with her, but next time he should remember to ask permission. Let's cover up but and look at both sides. She told him to come back to class with her. Next time he should remember to ask permission. This time I am looking at two independent clauses, so I do need a comma. A subordinate clause is a clause that has a subject and a verb, but cannot stand on its own to express a complete thought. An example is because I felt like it. I as my subject, felt as my verb, but I do not have a complete thought here. I'm trailing off. I need an independent clause to finish out the thought. While she was there. She is my subject, was is my verb, but I do not have a complete thought. I need an independent clause. When I heard him speak. I is my subject, heard is my verb, but I do not have a complete thought. I'm leaving you hanging. You're waiting to hear. When you heard him speak, what happened? Where are you going with that? Subordinate clauses begin with subordinate conjunctions. Here are some examples. If you take any independent clause, for example, I went to the store, and you put any subordinate conjunction in front of that clause, you no longer have a complete thought. Although I went to the store. Because I went to the store. Until I went to the store. Even though I went to the store. Now here's the trick. If the sentence begins with a subordinate clause, you must use a comma. When you go to the store, comma, bring back some milk. In red is my subordinate clause. That subordinate conjunction when turned an independent clause, you go to the store, into an incomplete thought. Suddenly, I needed a comma and an independent clause, bring back some milk to finish out my thought. Now, you do not need a comma if the sentence ends with a subordinate clause. Bring back some milk when you go to the store. Notice that all I did was flip the sentence. Now I've got that subordinate conjunction when in the middle of things. It is connecting these two sentences. Bring back some milk, you go to the store. This subordinate conjunction is strong enough to connect these two independent clauses without using a comma. Remember, those fanboys, your coordinating conjunctions, need a comma. Subordinate conjunctions do not need a comma. However, if my subordinate clause begins the sentence, like my sentence up here, I do need a comma before the independent clause. When Jeff and Mrs. Clark got back to the classroom, they found the rest of the class working quietly. Here's my subordinate conjunction when. When Jeff and Mrs. Clark got back to the classroom is a subordinate clause. I need a comma before I move into my independent clause. They found the rest of the class working quietly. Kevin carefully aimed a spitball at Mrs. Clark's head as Jeff slipped quietly back into his seat. My subordinate conjunction is as. This time it's in the middle of things. It's connecting these two independent clauses. So I do not need a comma. Because Mrs. Clark had not sent him to the office, Jeff felt compelled to warn her. My subordinate conjunction this time is because. This entire subordinate clause, because Mrs. Clark had not sent him to the office, is coming before the independent clause. Jeff felt compelled to warn her. So I do need a comma in between. Notice the placement of the conjunction. If it's a subordinate conjunction and it's in the middle of everything, no comma. If it leads the sentence, we do have a comma before that independent clause. Let's do some mixed practice. Watch out, Mrs. Clark, Jeff yelled as the spitball hit the air. Can you spot where we need the comma? You got it. Right before Mrs. Clark, because this is a direct address. I'm talking to Mrs. Clark and I'm naming her. She spun around quickly and was able to dodge the wet, lumpy mass hurtling towards her. First, let's check out that coordinating conjunction, and. I'm going to cover it up. On one side, she spun around quickly. That's an independent clause. Let's look at the other side. Was able to dodge the wet, lumpy mass hurtling towards her. This side is a fragment. I do not have a subject on this side. It cannot stand on its own, so I do not need a comma. But I do have an adjective series, wet, lumpy mass. Well, who did that? She asked calmly. This time I have an interjection, comma after well. Kevin, the guilty student, slunk down low in his seat and prayed that Jeff would not tell her. Here I have an appositive, the guilty student. Let's cover up that coordinating conjunction and check it out. Kevin, the guilty student, slunk down low in his seat. That's an independent clause. Prayed that Jeff would not tell her. That is not an independent clause. There's no subject on that side. So I do not need a comma around this coordinating conjunction. All of the students froze and the room fell silent. Let's cover up that coordinating conjunction and. On one side I have all of the students froze. That's an independent clause. The room fell silent. That is also an independent clause. So I do need a comma in this sentence. Even though he knew he should tell what he knew, Jeff just stared down at his desk. Even though is a subordinate conjunction. I'm looking at a subordinate clause in front of an independent clause, so I need a comma after knew. Kevin finally lifted up his head and said, I did it, Mrs. Clark. Let's look at this conjunction and. On one side I have Kevin finally lifted up his head. That is a sentence. But on the other side, said I did it, Mrs. Clark. I don't have a subject here. I didn't say who said it. So in this case, I do not need a comma in front of that conjunction. However, I do have a direct address. I'm talking to Mrs. Clark, so I need a comma before her name. Everyone was surprised when Mrs. Clark just thanked him for taking ownership of his actions and sat back at her desk. Let's cover up that conjunction and take a look. Everyone was surprised when Mrs. Clark just thanked him for taking ownership of his actions. That's an independent clause. But my other side, sat back at her desk, there's no subject, so I do not have a compound sentence, which means I do not put a comma there. Notice that I also have a subordinating conjunction, that word when. This subordinating conjunction, when, is connecting two independent clauses, but remember, subordinating conjunctions are strong enough to connect without a comma. That's why it's so important to memorize those coordinating conjunctions. If you know your 7 fanboys, you can always check for them, and then you know that any other conjunction you come across is a subordinating conjunction.